Hello everyone, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm creating a Halloween card using the Fall Halloween Curation by Stampers Anonymous and Tim Holtz. I built a spooky mixed media background with distress oxide sprays, collage stamping, and heat embossing, then layered on die cuts and this bold skull image colored with distress inks. Let's jump in and I'll show you how it all came together. So I'm going to be working with some of the stamps and stencils from the Stampers Anonymous September Curation with Tim Holtz. And with those curations, what they're doing is kind of reminding us of some of the older stamps and stencils that came out many years ago for some of these that were designed by Tim. And they never retire any of their products. They're all available on their website, but what they've done is kind of gone back to some of those earlier designs and put them together in kind of themed curations. So this September curation has a fall and Halloween theme with the stamps and stencils. And for this project, I'm going to be working with several of those stamps and stencils. So this stamp here called Components X-Ray is some of the inspiration for the background of this card. So I'll get into that more in the video. I'll be using this Halloween script stencil from Halloween, from the mini stencil set 23. I'm going to be working with Trick or Treat and the Halloween blueprint. If you are not a Halloween person, these techniques can be used for any theme. You could easily switch out and do a fall themed project using like the autumn blueprint stamp set that's included in this curation, and maybe use some other fall themed stencils and other fall themed stamps that you have. Along with the stencils and stamps, I'm also going to be working with a couple of Tim Holtz Sizzix dies, and this is the Spiderwebs die. There's the single one that here is a little bit larger, and then there's a smaller one in this Vault Fright Night set. And if you don't have both of these, that's totally fine. You could just use the one if you have one or the other. Or if you have some other kind of spiderweb die, you could use that. And that said, if you're not doing Halloween, you could certainly switch these out to any other kind of a die that you like. Just select one that works with the theme that you want to create with using these techniques. The mediums I'm going to be working with on this card include archival ink and black soot. You just need some sort of waterproof black ink. I've got an embossing ink pad, so any embossing ink pad will work. And then we're going to be doing some embossing, and I'm going to be using white embossing powder. Again, you could switch this out and do whatever color you would like. I've got some distress ink here and pumice stone and black soot. These can be switched out if you want to use oxide inks. You certainly could, or any other kind of ink. These are just going to be used for some edge inking and then a little bit of watercoloring. And then I'm also going to be using some spray ink. So I've got Distress Oxide Spray in Rusty Hinge and Frayed Burlap. These could be switched out with any kind of spray ink. The only thing I maybe wouldn't recommend are the mica stains because of their opacity and how they could end up covering up the layers that we'll be spraying these over. And then the other spray I'm going to be using is the Distress Mica Stain in Frozen Fog. And again, this could be replaced with any kind of a sparkle shimmer spray that you might have. And then as always, the paper I'm going to be working with is Distress Watercolor Cardstock, or feel free to use any type of paper that can handle wet mediums such as spray inks. The background for this card was inspired by this stamp. This is part of the Components collection, which are really just like ATC sized stamps. So they're 3x4 and they have like a collage style to them, which if you all know me, I love to do collage style stamping. And this stamp set has the images that are on this ATC. So this is called Trick or Treat. So I'm going to use these to kind of recreate this image in a larger size for my background. So obviously I'm doing a Halloween themed card, but you could certainly do this same card with a fall theme using another one of the component type stamps as maybe some inspiration, or just do your own collage style stamping. So there's just lots of options when it comes to where you can get some inspiration. So I'm going to start off with that spider web stamp, and I've got a piece of distress watercolor cardstock, and I'm working on the smooth side. And this is an A2 size card for the finished design, so I've just cut this down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, and I'm stamping with some black soot archival ink, and I'm using the archival ink because it's waterproof, and once it's dry, which it dries really quickly, I will have you know, a water resistant image. So as I add on my next layers and mediums, I don't have to worry about this image bleeding or anything, which, you know, if that doesn't matter to you, then that would give you a totally different look, which would be super cool and a little more distressed. You could certainly use a different ink that's, you know, water reactive even. So we've got our spiderweb stamped, and I'm just going to kind of bring this image in back here to kind of refresh my brain where I might want to stamp the other images here. Get them in there like that. So that's the skeleton and the bats. Ink those up. And if you want a really, really nice dark impression, just make sure your ink pad's nice and juicy, and you can stamp that a couple times and really get a nice crisp image even on this watercolor paper. And then lastly, I'm going to add this kind of barbed wire looking image there. So let's stamp that. So now we have kind of a redo of that stamped image. Now I just realized I did stamp the spider web kind of upside down, but I'm okay with that. It's all good. Because we're going to be adding even more layers to this. So when this is all finished, you're not even going to see all of what we just did here. So as always with my cards and projects, you can stop at any stage of the process and still have a really cool background. So just keep that in mind. So now we're going to do some ink spraying, and I've got here Distress Oxide Spray in Rusty Hinge and Frayed Burlap. You could certainly switch these out and just use regular distress sprays or any other sprays you might have. I wouldn't recommend the mica stains for this because they're going to completely cover up the stamping because of their opacity. You know, so those would probably be the only ones I maybe wouldn't recommend for this. And then just gonna add some squirts of color here and there and go from there. And anytime you're working with the sprays, just, you know, make sure you shake them up really well, especially the oxide sprays. And that way that gets the pigment mixed in properly. And a lot of these have a little rattle ball in there that lets you know that they need to be mixed in. And that'll kind of minimize the clogging that you might get. And so now I'm just gonna, you know, spray that with just a little bit of some water, and I'm going to just give this a dry. And you're getting some of that ink kind of pooling on the sides there. You can take your paper towel and kind of dab up some of that, or you can pick it up and tap it off a little bit, and that'll make that ink run a little bit more. So it's really kind of however you would like to do it there. And if you've got some big spots here that maybe just are a lot more ink than maybe you want, you can always dab that off too. And as you notice, when I sprayed this, I kind of did the Rusty Hinge like 1, 2, 3, kind of in a triangle, and then I did the same thing with the Frayed Burlap, and that just kind of helps spread the color kind of across the paper a little more evenly-ish, and kind of keeps your eye moving with those colors. And then from here we want to make sure this layer is completely dry. So we're going to get this really nice and dry before we move on to the next step. so as I mentioned, at this point in time, if you want to be finished with this background, like you're happy with how this looks, there is nothing wrong with that. You could stop at this point and skip to the embellishment part and be done with this background. However, if you want to stick with me for some more layering and adding some more mixed media to the card, we're going to progress to that next. So now we're going to do some stencil work with some heat embossing, and just to make sure that we kind of minimize powder sticking everywhere, if you want to use a little anti-static tool, you can do that. Just kind of lightly brush over the surface with that. But again, you do want to make sure the paper and the ink is all really dry from the sprays. And here I've got the Halloween script stencil, and this is from Mini Set 23, and I'm just going to kind of position it kind of over to the side here. And you could also use the larger of these if you like. And I'm working on a sticky mat, but I still feel like I need a little bit of help holding this down here. So I'm going to use a little bit of mint tape as well. Now we're going to take the embossing ink, and you can use like a little sponge dauber or whatever you like to apply it through. And then I'm just going to apply the embossing ink through the stencil. You just want to make sure you get a nice good coating of ink. I don't recommend rubbing it because then you're likely to get the ink under the stencil. And there are some kind of small little detail areas on this stencil that it would be kind of easy to get underneath. So just kind of a pouncing type motion. And you can kind of go back over it here and there just to make sure you're getting good coverage. Lift off that stencil. And I'm just going to put a piece of printer paper underneath there. And I'm going to pour some white embossing powder over where we just put all that ink. And there we go. So if you find that you've gotten some powder that's like stray powder that you don't want somewhere, you can just grab a little brush, depending on how like I completely missed getting ink in that area. That's okay. It's all good. I'm not going to worry about that. So let's put the powder back in the jar. And then I'm just going to use my heat gun to heat emboss this. Now, if you find that maybe you didn't get enough ink on there, which I kind of feel like I didn't on this one, you can line that stencil back up and go back over this, which I'm going to do off camera here. Like I mentioned, off camera, I went back and added another layer of the ink and re-embossed it. And you really, by doing that, sometimes I kind of really like how you get just a little bit more texture and smoothness with the embossing. This is a couple areas where I didn't get a lot of ink to begin with on the first time, and then I didn't even get a lot the second time, so you can kind of see where it's a little less ink and more bubbly. So it just gives you a different look, but so however you want to do it is fine. The only other thing I'm going to do here is add some inking to the edges, and I'll do that with a little bit of pumice stone and black soot distress ink. All right, so I'm just going to start off with a little bit of pumice stone here, load up my blending brush, and then I'm just going to ink that around the edges here. And again, this is another step you could skip if you like. I just always like to ink the edges. I just feel like it kind of helps frame the image. And I don't know, just something that just kind of makes my eye happy. It's just very subtle, especially because we're using such a light color. And now we're going to go add a little black soot. And for this, I'm going to hold it up and kind of rub it around the edges there. So you're going to get a little bit thinner amount of ink on the edge. So it just gives it a little bit slightly harsher edging, but that's kind of what I'm going for here. There we go. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some water splatters. And this obviously is another one of those steps you can skip if you like. I always like the way this ends up looking, especially with the oxide inks or even the distress inks if you use the distress sprays. Just adds another layer of distress and interest to things, so you can kind of see that water reactivating the ink, and especially with the oxide you're going to get some of those like white spots here and there. So we'll just give that a good dry. And if you're getting impatient with the drying, you can also just give it a second to cool, because you've kind of reheated that embossing powder and it will be sticky. So just give that a second to cool off. And then once that's cool, you can just take a paper towel and dab off some of those water droplets, and that'll lift off some of that ink and add even more interest to the background there with that. Now, for some of the embellishments on the card, I used some die-cut spider webs, and this larger one is from the spider web die, and then this one's just slightly smaller. It's maybe about like a 1/4 inch smaller, and this one's from the Vault Fright Night set. So if you have both of these, you could use the two different ones, or if you just have one or the other of these, just use that one. You don't need both of these for sure. And then, as I told you earlier, we're going to be covering up a lot of what's underneath there. So if you want to skip this step, again, you can. I just love to add layers and texture and interest. So that is what we're going to do. But I didn't want these to stay just black. So we're going to add some interest to them. Grab my splat box again here, and now I'm going to add some Distress Mica Stain. And the color I'm using here is Frozen Fog. You just want to make sure you shake that up until it's all mixed in, because that will help eliminate clogging. So then once you've got it mixed in really well, you're just going to spritz these just lightly and kind of standing or kind of holding it back a little bit. And just a couple mists is all you probably need. And it's really going to show up a little bit more when it's fully dry. Another option you could, if you wanted, you could maybe cut these out of white cardstock and spritz them with that same color spray, and they would be a little less maybe noticeable on the background, maybe a little more subtle. So, but it would give you a cool look. So these then are ready to adhere to our background. So I'm just going to use a little bit of liquid adhesive and kind of layer them onto the background here, and then just snip off that excess that's overhanging. All right, so now we're going to stamp the focal image, and I'm going to be using this skull here from the Halloween Blueprint stamp set. If you're not into Halloween, you could easily switch this out and maybe use the Autumn Blueprint stamp set. Or if you wanted to do Christmas or whatever holiday, they've got tons of blueprint sets that are themed for so many things. So like I said, you could take this same technique that I'm using and switch up the colors and the stencils and the stamps and create whatever color theme you want. So I'm stamping this image twice. I'm stamping onto some watercolor cardstock using archival ink again, wanting a permanent ink that's not going to bleed, because I'm going to watercolor these. And the reason I stamped this twice is I'm going to cut these out and layer them to just add a little bit of dimension. Now this is a step you don't have to do. You could certainly just stamp it once and color it and cut it out and be done, but I love to add dimension and interest to things. So now to color these, I'm going to add a little bit of pumice stone ink, which I'm just applying that to my craft mat, and then I have a water brush. You could also use just a paintbrush and some water. Kind of get that ink moving and flowing. So add that water, mix it in there. And then I'm going to take that kind of more intense color that we have on there and add that to the areas that already have like a shadow on them, because that's going to be kind of the darker part. Add a little bit more intense color there. And then we can go a little lighter with the color to the lighter areas here on the skull. So on this one, I'm just coloring the main skull image, and then on this one, I'm going to color just the bones, because we're going to cut out that skull and layer it on top of this one. So on this one, you don't need to worry about coloring in the skull unless you just want to. So I'm going to give that a little dry. And then if you want those colors to get a little bit more intense, you can add a little more ink and just add another layer of ink, and you can see how that will, those colors when it's dry, they're going to layer on top of each other and just darken just a little bit darker, especially these lighter colors. And then we'll give that another dry. And then just take some scissors and fussy cut out the skull on this one, and then the skull and the bones on this one. So you don't need to cut out any of the words or anything. So then once you get everything cut out, you can ink the edges a little bit if you like. I'm just using a little bit of that leftover black soot that I had on my brush from earlier. And then from here, you're just going to add some double-sided foam adhesive to the back side of the skull. And then just pop up that layer, and it just adds a little bit more depth and interest to the element, but again, it's not necessary. So now we have all of our components except for the sentiment. On the original card, I used the Happy Halloween sentiment from Mini Halloween. And when I went back to record this, I was like, well, why don't I just use this one? Now, they're slightly different in size. This one is just a little bit smaller than the skull, and then this one is just a little bit larger. So if you don't want both of these stamp sets, you could certainly use the larger sentiment on the card, or if you're interested in this other one for any reason, or maybe you already have this one, you could use this, or you could use any Halloween sentiment. You don't have to use any of these stamps or stencils or dies or anything that I'm using. So the idea here is just to get out your supplies and enjoy the process of playing with what you have. Thanks so much for watching. This skull card is just one of several projects I've created with the Fall Halloween Curation. Each one highlights a different technique, so if you'd like more Halloween and fall inspiration, be sure to check out my other videos. As always, you'll find links to all of the products I use in the description box below, along with a visual supply list for a quick look at everything. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you gave it a thumbs up and subscribe for more crafty inspiration, tips, and techniques. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay crafty, my friend.